It wasn't supposed to be fair. World War II films didn't give the enemy respect, didn't make them human, didn't let them think. But the enemy below broke the rules. It turned a submarine hunt into a chess match between two captains who never wanted the war in the first place. And behind the scenes, nothing went according to plan. The star almost drowned. The director had never commanded a ship, and one scene, the studio thought it would sink the entire production. These are 20 weird facts about the enemy below. And the bonus fact, well, let's just say the Navy saw something in this film that Hollywood never expected. Battle stations. This story goes deep fast. When number 1. Dick Powell didn't look like a war director. He'd spent decades as a song and dance man, crooning his way through Warner Brothers musicals in the 1930s, all bright smiles and tap shoes. Then he pivoted hard into noir, playing tough guys and private eyes, but directing a naval warfare film? That was different. The studio had doubts, big ones. They wanted someone with military experience, someone who understood tactics, tonnage, and torpedo spreads. Powell had none of that. What he had was obsession. He'd read every book on submarine warfare he could find, interviewed Navy veterans for months, studied German U-boat tactics until he could recite attack patterns in his sleep. He showed up to pre-production meetings with notebooks full of diagrams, his own storyboards, technical questions that stumped the naval advisors. And when the studio finally let him shoot, he didn't just direct scenes, he commanded them. Crew members said he ran the set like a captain runs a bridge, calm under pressure, decisive, never second-guessing. The former song and dance man turned The Enemy Below into one of the most technically accurate war films of the 1950s. Not because he'd lived it, because he'd studied it like his career depended on it, and it did. Number 2, Burr. Robert Mitchum wasn't the studio's first choice to play Captain Merle. They wanted someone older, more severe, a commander with gravitas carved into his face, someone like James Cagney or Humphrey Bogart, actors who could carry authority without trying. But Mitchum had something else: exhaustion. By 1957, he'd lived through a scandal, served time for marijuana possession, survived a Hollywood blacklist whisper campaign, and kept working anyway with a shrug that said he'd seen worse. That weariness, that deep-rooted fatigue, it was exactly what Dick Powell needed. Because Captain Merle wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was a man who'd already lost too much, commanding a ship in a war he no longer believed in, hunting a submarine because orders said so, not because hate drove him. Mitchum understood that. He played Merle with quiet weight, every decision heavy, every order delivered like it cost him something. And the crew noticed. Between takes, Mitchum would stand at the rail, smoking, staring at the water, staying in character even when the cameras weren't rolling. He didn't need to shout or swagger. He just had to show up tired and human. And somehow that made him the perfect captain for a war film that refused to glorify war. Number 3, Kurt Jurgens almost turned the role down. Playing a German U-boat captain in an American film just 12 years after the war ended, it was risky. Jurgens was already a star in Europe, but Hollywood saw him as the enemy, literally. He'd spent the war entertaining German troops, and even though he'd been arrested by the Gestapo for anti-Nazi activities, the stain lingered. When the script arrived, he read it twice. Most war films painted Germans as monsters, sneering villains who deserved every torpedo. But The Enemy Below was different. Captain von Stolberg was intelligent, conflicted, weary, a man who questioned his orders and respected his opponent. Jurgens saw something rare, a chance to play a German officer with dignity, so he said yes, but only if Powell promised one thing: no melodrama, no screaming speeches, no over-the-top villainy. Von Stolberg had to feel real, and Powell agreed. What emerged was a performance so layered that American audiences, who'd spent a decade watching Nazis get mowed down in war films, found themselves rooting for the U-boat captain's survival. It was uncomfortable, it was intentional, and it changed how Hollywood would portray the enemy for decades to come. Number 4. The USS Whitehurst wasn't a prop. It was a real destroyer escort, Daldai 634, that had served in World War II and was still active when filming began. The Navy agreed to loan the ship to the production, but with conditions. No fake damage to the hull, no simulated fires that could actually harm the vessel, and every maneuver had to be approved by a commanding officer who stayed on set throughout the shoot. Dick Powell didn't mind. He wanted authenticity, and shooting on a working warship gave the film something most productions couldn't fake: real weight. The actors weren't walking on plywood painted gray. They were standing on steel decks that had seen combat, touching equipment that had fired live rounds, sleeping in bunks that still smelled like diesel and sweat. Robert Mitchum later said the ship taught him how to play the captain, the way it moved, the sounds it made, the tight corridors that forced you to duck and turn. All of it seeped into his performance. And when the cameras rolled for action sequences, the crew wasn't pretending. They were running real drills, operating real machinery, and occasionally forgetting a movie was even being made. Because on the Whitehurst, the line between acting and duty blurred fast. Number 5. There was no real German U-boat available, so the production built one. Not a full-sized replica, but a 40-foot section that could be submerged, tilted, and flooded on command in a massive water tank at the Fox studio lot. It cost a fortune, and it nearly killed the production. The first test went fine. They lowered the set into the water, pumped in some leaks for effect, and rolled cameras. But on the second day, something went wrong. A valve malfunctioned. Water rushed in faster than planned. The set started sinking, not slowly, but fast, and the crew was still inside. Kurt Jurgens and 3 stunt actors scrambled for the hatch as the tank operators screamed to drain the water. They made it out, soaked and shaken. But the set was ruined. Pumps ran for hours. The interior was destroyed. Costumes trashed, equipment lost. Dick Powell watched it all from the observation platform, silent, calculating how much this disaster would cost. The studio wanted to scrap the underwater scenes entirely, but Powell refused. He ordered the set rebuilt, stronger this time, with fail-safes that actually worked. 2 weeks later, they went back in. The actors were terrified, but they did it anyway. Because in The Enemy Below, if the danger didn't feel real, the story wouldn't either. Number 6. The depth charge explosions weren't miniatures or optical effects. They were real. The Navy agreed to supply live ordnance for certain shots. Actual depth charges detonated underwater, at a safe distance from the ship, but close enough to feel. The crew rigged multiple cameras at different angles, knowing they'd only get one take per explosion. When the first charge went off, the blast was bigger than anyone expected. Water shot 60 feet into the air. The shockwave hit the Whitehurst hard enough to rattle equipment and knock a cameraman off his feet. Robert Mitchum, standing on deck for the shot, didn't flinch. He later joked that he'd been through worse in real life, but the crew said his face went pale for just a second. They filmed 5 more blasts over 3 days, each one carefully calculated, each one terrifyingly real, and the footage, it was unlike anything audiences had seen. No models, no rear projection, just raw, destructive force captured on film. The studio's insurance agents had a meltdown. The safety reports ran 40 pages. But Dick Powell got what he wanted. Explosions that made you feel the ocean's violence. The kind you couldn't fake in 1957. The kind that reminded everyone watching that war wasn't a game played with toys. Number 7. The screenplay was based on a novel by Dennis Rayner, a British naval officer who'd actually hunted U-boats during the war. His book, The Enemy Below, wasn't fiction pretending to be real. It was experience wrapped in narrative, every tactic grounded in actual engagements, every decision pulled from moments when miscalculation meant death. Rayner didn't romanticize combat. He wrote it cold, technical, exhausting, a chess match played with lives where both players respected the board. When Wendell Mays adapted the screenplay, he kept that tone, stripping out Hollywood heroics, focusing instead on 2 captains thinking, reacting, trying to outsmart each other while their crews waited in silence. The studio hated the early drafts. Too quiet, they said. Not enough action? Where were the stirring speeches? Where was the triumphant music? Mays refused to change it. He argued that real naval warfare was 90% waiting and 10% chaos, and the film needed to reflect that. Dick Powell backed him completely. They kept the long stretches of tension, the scenes where nothing happens except 2 men thinking, the moments where respect grows between enemies who will never meet. It made the final confrontation hit harder, not because of explosions, but because the audience had lived inside both captains' heads, understanding that neither wanted to be there. Number 8. Robert Mitchum did his own stunts during the deck scenes, and during one take, he nearly went overboard. The Whitehurst was running at full speed, cameras mounted on the bow, capturing Mitchum as Captain Merle, scanning the horizon through binoculars. The sea was rougher than expected. A wave hit the ship broadside just as Mitchum stepped toward the rail. The deck tilted hard. His feet slipped. For a split second, he was airborne, binoculars still in hand, heading for the water. A grip grabbed his belt at the last possible moment, yanked him back, slammed him against the bulkhead. Mitchum hit hard enough to bruise his ribs and knock the wind out of him, but he didn't stop shooting. He stood up, adjusted his cap, and asked if they got the shot. They had. Powell asked if he needed a break. Mitchum said no, lit a cigarette, and stayed on deck for the next 3 hours, finishing the sequence. That night, the crew talked about how close it had been. 6 more inches and Mitchum would have been in the Atlantic, uniforms soaked, cameras rolling, rescue boats scrambling. But the man himself never mentioned it again. Just another day at work for someone who'd survived worse and figured drowning wasn't in the cards that afternoon. Number 9. The final battle sequence took 11 days to shoot and required coordination between 3 different naval vessels, 2 helicopters, and a submarine that wasn't supposed to be there. The Navy had agreed to provide support, but when filming began, an active-duty submarine happened to be training in the same waters. Its captain, a fan of war films, radioed the production and asked if they needed a real sub for background shots. Dick Powell said yes, immediately. For 2 days, an actual U.S. submarine surfaced, submerged, and maneuvered near the Whitehurst, while cameras captured everything. The footage was so authentic that the studio's continuity supervisor panicked, worried audiences would wonder why an American submarine looked so modern. Powell didn't care. He used the shots anyway, trusting that the story was strong enough that viewers wouldn't question the details. He was right. When the film premiered, critics praised the battle for its realism, the way ships moved, the way water behaved, the weight of every decision visible on screen. No one asked about submarine models or studio tanks. They were too busy watching 2 men hunt each other with methodical precision, knowing one of them wouldn't survive, and somehow hoping both would. Number 10. Kurt Jurgens didn't speak English well when filming began. He'd learned enough to read the script, but his accent was thick, his phrasing awkward, his rhythm off. Dick Powell saw it as a problem that became a gift. He told Jurgens to stop trying to sound American and lean into the German cadence, to let von Stolberg's orders carry the weight of a man thinking in one language and speaking another. It gave the character an unexpected layer. Every command felt considered, carefully chosen, as if von Stolberg was translating his thoughts before releasing them. And in moments of stress, when the U-boat was under attack, Jurgens would slip into German entirely, shouting orders to his crew in his native tongue before catching himself and switching back. Powell loved it. He kept those moments in the film, unscripted and raw, because they reminded audiences that von Stolberg wasn't a Hollywood villain. He was a real person commanding a real crew, fighting in a language that wasn't his own, in a war he no longer believed in. By the end of production, Jurgens' English had improved dramatically, but the performance stayed rooted in that early struggle, the sound of a man caught between worlds, and it made every scene he was in feel authentic in a way perfect English never could have. Number 11. The sonar ping sound that became iconic throughout the film wasn't recorded on a real destroyer. Sound engineers tried capturing authentic sonar from Navy equipment, but the actual noise was too subtle, too technical, not dramatic enough for cinema. So they created something new in the studio, blending metal resonance with electronic oscillation, shaping a sound that felt real without being real. They tested dozens of variations, playing them for naval consultants who'd spent years listening to sonar. Most veterans said the movie version was wrong, but one retired sonar operator admitted something interesting. He said the fake sound captured the feeling better than the real thing, the tension, the waiting, the knowledge that each ping might reveal death approaching. Dick Powell ran with that endorsement. The sound became the film's heartbeat, appearing in moments of silence when both crews listened, waited, hoped the echo wouldn't return with bad news. It's been copied in every submarine film since, that distinct ping growing louder as contact closes, but the enemy below created it first. Not because they had access to perfect recordings, because they understood that sometimes movie truth matters more than actual truth. That sometimes the audience needs to feel what the characters feel, even if the sound isn't precisely accurate. And that decision, that willingness to choose emotion over documentation, it's why the film still works decades later when technical accuracy has been surpassed by newer productions. Number 12. Theodore Bickel, who played von Stolberg's second-in-command, was actually Jewish and had fled Nazi Germany as a teenager. Taking the role meant wearing the uniform of men who'd wanted him dead, saluting a flag that represented his family's nightmare, speaking German in scenes that glorified tactics used against Allied ships. He almost said no, but then he read the script completely and saw what Powell was doing. Von Stolberg wasn't a Nazi. He was a professional sailor trapped in an evil regime's war, and his crew weren't monsters. They were men following orders they questioned, surviving a conflict they couldn't escape. Bickel signed on with one condition. His character would never give a Nazi salute, never shout fascist slogans, never behave like the propaganda caricatures that filled other war films. Powell agreed immediately. Throughout filming, Bickel brought a quiet dignity to every scene, his performance a subtle rebellion against the very ideology the uniform represented. Other actors didn't know his background until midway through production. When they found out, the set went quiet for a moment. Someone asked if wearing the costume bothered him. Bickel said it did, every single day, but that was exactly why he'd accepted the role. Because showing that not every German sailor was a fanatic, that some were just men caught in history's machinery, that mattered more than his personal discomfort. Number 13. The studio wanted to cut the ending. In their version, the American destroyer would sink the U-boat. Captain Merle would stand victorious on the bridge. Credits would roll over triumphant music. Clean, heroic, satisfying. Dick Powell refused. He'd spent months building towards something different. A conclusion where victory felt hollow, where survival came at a cost no one wanted to pay, where enemies became something closer to tragic brothers. The original ending stayed. Von Stolberg orders his crew to abandon ship, then stays behind to go down with his vessel. Merle watches through binoculars, recognizing the captain's dignity, ordering his crew to rescue the German survivors. No cheering, no celebration, just exhaustion and respect. Test audiences sat in stunned silence. Studio executives panicked. They ran the numbers, consulted marketing, debated whether American viewers in 1957 would accept a war film that didn't glorify victory. Powell stood firm. He told them if they changed one frame of the ending, he'd remove his name from the picture. The threat worked. The ending stayed intact, and when the film released, something unexpected happened. Veterans, real combat sailors who'd fought in the Atlantic, wrote letters praising the film's honesty. They said Powell had captured something other directors missed: the weight of killing men you respected, the emptiness of necessary violence, the truth that war creates no real winners, just survivors carrying memories they'd rather forget. Number 14. The depth charge attack scenes required the actors underwater to hold their breath longer than safety regulations allowed. The U-boat set was submerged in the tank with actors inside, cameras running as explosions detonated nearby, creating shockwaves through the water. Each take lasted over a minute, and the actors couldn't surface early, or the shot was ruined. Kurt Jurgens trained for weeks, practicing breath control, learning to slow his heart rate, fighting the panic that comes when your lungs start burning and the surface is sealed above you. During one take, he ran out of air. His face went red. His movements became erratic, but the cameras were still rolling, and Powell hadn't called cut. Jurgens held on, his body screaming for oxygen, until finally the director's voice crackled through the underwater speakers. The moment the hatch opened, Jurgens exploded to the surface, gasping, coughing, vision spotted. The medic wanted to shut down production. Jurgens said no, give him 20 minutes. They compromised on 30 and then went back under for 4 more takes. Later, someone asked why he'd pushed himself that far. Jurgens said because von Stolberg would have. Because when you're playing a man drowning in a steel coffin, actually drowning just a little bit helps you understand what that desperation feels like. And audiences can tell the difference between someone acting scared and someone who's genuinely terrified. Number 15. The The film's score by Lee Harleen was unlike any war film music of its era. Most productions went for bombast, marching drums, soaring strings that told audiences when to feel patriotic. Harleen composed something quieter, more contemplative. Themes that played during battle felt less like triumph and more like tragedy. He used low brass for tension, sparse strings for isolation, silence for the moments between pings when both crews held their breath. The studio's music department hated it. They wanted something bigger, more commercial, easier to sell on record albums. Harleen refused to change a note. He'd studied the script, understood Powell's vision, and knew the music had to reinforce the film's core message. War is not glorious. During the final mix, Powell sat in the sound booth listening to the score laid against picture, and reportedly got emotional. Harleen had given him exactly what he'd needed. Music that didn't tell the audience how to feel, but let them sit with the story's complexity, its moral weight. When the Academy Award nominations came, the score was overlooked. Too subtle, critics said. Not memorable enough. But decades later, film composers cited as revolutionary. One of the first war film scores that dared to be mournful instead of triumphant, that treated combat as tragedy rather than adventure, that understood both sides of the conflict. We're losing something that couldn't be measured in sunk ships or body counts. Number 16. Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jurgens never met on camera, their characters existing in separate worlds connected only by strategy and respect. But between takes, they became friends. They'd sit in Mitchum's trailer, sharing drinks, discussing the script, arguing about warfare philosophy, finding common ground despite representing opposite sides of history's greatest conflict. Mitchum would ask about Jurgens' war experience, listening quietly as the German actor described what it felt like performing for soldiers who'd later die on frozen Russian fields. Jurgens would ask about Mitchum's past, the scandals, the arrests, the refusal to conform. They recognized something in each other, outsiders playing roles that demanded they embody authority they didn't naturally claim. On the last day of filming, they exchanged gifts. Mitchum gave Jurgens a bottle of bourbon with a note that said, "Thank you for not making me feel like I was killing a cartoon." Jurgens gave Mitchum a compass with an inscription in German that translated to some wars are only won by refusing to fight. Neither man spoke about it publicly, but crew members who witnessed their friendship said it proved what the film was trying to say, that enemies are often just people on different ships, following different orders, wishing they were anywhere else. And if circumstances changed, they might have been friends instead of adversaries trying to sink each other in cold water. Number 17. The technical accuracy extended to impossible details most viewers would never notice. Every gauge in the destroyer's engine room showed correct readings for the ship's speed. Every map coordinate mentioned in dialogue corresponded to actual Atlantic positions. Every tactical decision made by both captains followed real naval doctrine from World War II training manuals. Dick Powell hired 3 naval consultants, all combat veterans, and gave them veto power over anything that felt false. They used it constantly. Scripts were rewritten mid-shoot, when an advisor pointed out that no destroyer captain would make that turn at that speed. Scenes were reblocked when someone noticed the sonar operator wasn't holding his equipment correctly. Even background actors received training on proper procedures, how to relay orders, how to move through tight corridors, how to brace during depth charge attacks. One consultant reportedly told Powell he was wasting time, that audiences wouldn't notice if a valve was turned clockwise instead of counterclockwise. Powell disagreed. He believed that accumulation of small truths created larger authenticity, that even if viewers couldn't identify specific details, they'd sense the difference between a film that cared about accuracy and one that faked everything. The consultants stayed through the entire production, and when filming wrapped, all 3 said, "The Enemy Below was the only Hollywood war film they'd recommend to fellow veterans, not because it glorified their service, but because it finally showed warfare as they had experienced it. Technical, exhausting, morally complicated, and ultimately pointless regardless of who won." Number 18. The Enemy Below was released in December 1957, just 12 years after World War II ended, at a time when Cold War tensions made any film showing respect between American and German forces politically risky. Some veterans groups protested, calling the film unpatriotic, arguing that giving dignity to a U-boat captain, dishonored Allied sailors who died fighting Germany. Theater owners in certain cities refused to book it. But then something unexpected happened. Actual submarine veterans, both American and German, started showing up to screenings. They'd watch in silence, leave without commenting, then return the next night with more veterans. Word spread through veteran communities that someone had finally made a film that got it right, that showed submarine warfare not as adventure, but as claustrophobic terror, that treated both sides as professionals doing impossible jobs in impossible conditions. The protests faded, box office numbers climbed. The film found its audience not among casual moviegoers seeking entertainment, but among people who'd lived through variations of what they saw on screen and recognized truth when it appeared. Some German U-boat survivors sent letters to the studio, thanking the filmmakers for showing that not every German sailor was a Nazi, that some had simply been boys drafted into service, following orders because refusing meant execution. The letters were quiet, grateful, and often written decades after the war by men still processing what they'd survived and trying to reconcile the people they'd become with the uniforms they'd once worn. Number 19. Dick Powell never directed another war film after The Enemy Below. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do, and perhaps knew he couldn't top it. Instead, he returned to producing, helping launch television series, and mentoring younger directors. But crew members said something changed in him during production, that living inside a war story for months, commanding a set like a ship, making life and death decisions, even fictional ones, had affected him deeply. He became quieter, more contemplative, less interested in Hollywood glamour. In interviews during the film's release, reporters asked if he'd make a sequel or tackle another naval story. Powell said no, once was enough. He'd told the story he needed to tell, said what he needed to say about respect between enemies, about the tragedy of capable men forced to kill each other over politics they couldn't control. He never explained further, but those who worked with him understood. The Enemy Below wasn't just a film about submarine warfare. It was Powell's statement about the cost of conflict, about recognizing humanity in people you're supposed to hate, about understanding that victory in war is always Pyrrhic. He'd made that statement perfectly, and anything else would have been redundant. Sometimes the best follow-up to a masterpiece is silence, letting the work speak for itself without dilution or imitation. Number 20. The film won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects in 1958, beating productions with far larger budgets and more spectacular sequences. The award recognized not explosions or miniatures, but the accumulation of authentic details, the realistic water, the genuine depth charge blasts, the way ships move like actual vessels instead of studio models. It remains one of the few times the Academy gave the effects Oscar to a film, prioritizing realism over spectacle. Dick Powell wasn't at the ceremony. He'd caught pneumonia during post-production and was recovering at home. When told about the win, he reportedly said, "That's nice," and went back to sleep. The statue eventually made its way to his office, where it sat on a shelf behind his desk, largely ignored. Years later, someone asked if he was proud of the achievement. Powell said the real achievement was that veterans didn't laugh at the film, that submariners from both sides could watch it without feeling betrayed. The Oscar was just Hollywood acknowledging what naval veterans had understood immediately. The Enemy Below had captured something true about warfare's reality, something most films avoided because truth doesn't sell tickets as easily as heroic fantasy. But Powell hadn't made it to sell tickets. He'd made it because someone needed to show that enemies are human, that respect and conflict can coexist, and that sometimes the hardest victory is choosing not to celebrate when the battle ends. Bonus fact: the United States Navy loved The Enemy Below so much they did something unprecedented. They bought prints of the film and screened it at the Naval Academy in Annapolis as part of officer training, not as entertainment, as education. They used it to teach tactical thinking, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of respecting your opponent's capabilities. For decades, midshipmen watched Captain Merle and Captain von Stolberg hunt each other, studied their choices, debated alternative strategies, learned that warfare is chess played with lives where both players deserve respect, regardless of uniform. The film became part of naval curriculum, alongside technical manuals and historical documentation. Proof that sometimes fiction captures truth better than facts, that sometimes a movie made by a former song and dance man teaches more about leadership than textbooks written by generals. The prints wore out from repeated screenings. The Navy kept ordering replacements. And somewhere in that continuous cycle of watching, studying, discussing, The Enemy Below transcended its origins as Hollywood entertainment and became something else entirely, a teaching tool about the complexity of conflict, the humanity of enemies, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory is surviving with your principles intact. Dick Powell never knew the full extent of the Navy's adoption. He died in 1963, 6 years after the film's release. But the tradition continued, and even today, naval officers occasionally reference the film when discussing tactical doctrine, respect for adversaries, and the moral weight of command decisions. Because The Enemy Below didn't just tell a war story, it told the truth about what war costs, and some truths never stop being relevant.